Friends and fellow inquisitors of history, lend me your ears. We are here to address a most improbable claim, that the indomitable Ragnar Lothbrok, a figure equal parts heroic, barbaric, and legendary, was tossed into a pit of slithering serpents by the vengeful King Aella of Northumbria. At first blush, the entire spectacle reeks of medieval sensationalism, swirling sagas and half-literate monks conjuring devilish images to stoke fear among the unwashed faithful. But let us not dismiss it out of hand quite yet, for if we do we might miss a rather sublime reconciliation of fact, folklore, and biology. One hears, quite reflexively, the retort, there weren't enough snakes in Dark Age Britain to fill a goat's milking pail, let alone a pit. It is a scornful aside, no doubt accompanied by the rustle of academic papers and the smug lifting of eyebrows. But as ever, arrogance and ignorance perform a neat little tango when we ignore that nature, in its cunning, always finds ways to persist, especially when less encumbered by modern disruption. Medieval Britain, after all, was neither tidily manicured nor comprehensively deforested. In those days we had swathes of open heath and forest, wetlands and moors, a temperate climate that shifted over centuries. Environments, in short, ripe for breeding all manner of creeping, crawling, biting fauna. Now let us speak of the adder, Vipera berus, the only truly venomous snake native to Britain, though not the most lethal compared to the show-stopping vipers of India or the cobras of Africa. Still, in a scenario worthy of a primitive cautionary tale, a sufficiently large number of these small but spirited adders could indeed dispatch a hapless, unprotected captive, and let us underscore, sufficiently large number. While a single adder's bite might be little more than a painful nuisance for a healthy adult, a half-dozen or more bites to a man pinned in a cramped, slithering arena could spell certain doom. Add a measure of theatrical cruelty. This is an execution, after all, and the notion becomes rather more credible than one might initially presume. We next consider timing. The sagas say that Ragnar was thrown into this pit sometime in the autumn of 865, whereupon he delivered those stirring final words about how the little piglets would squeal if they knew how the old boar suffers. In other words, dear reader, an immediate incitement for vengeance. If you or I were in the business of practical cruelty, perish the thought, we would require a consistent supply of suitably lively, sufficiently venomous reptiles. Now, if you've managed to keep awake during any half-competent biology class, you'd know that British adders prefer to hibernate in the chill of winter. They begin to slink into hidden dens sometime in October, perhaps a fortnight or two later if the weather's kind. In the so-called medieval warm period, mind you, they might well have lingered above ground a bit longer, or coiled near their winter dens, less torpid, more easily captured. So imagine King Aella's men, with a judicious measure of cunning, scouring the heaths and rocky crevices in mid to late October, gleaning lethargic adders by the basketful, an undertaking both gruesome and pedantic but nonetheless feasible. It would be no more outlandish than various other medieval practices, the torture contraptions, the lavish pyres, the ritual humiliations doled out like some perverse spectacle for the howling crowd. Let us not kid ourselves that human cruelty, particularly in that era, was in short supply or lacked for imaginative flourishes. Next, consider the sagas themselves. Ragnar's saga Lothbrok, Tale of Ragnar's Sons, Saxo Grammaticus's Gesta Danorum. Each invests their version of Ragnar's end with suitably tragic grandeur. The Norse authors, like their Greek and Roman precursors, rarely let historical trifles like a consistent climate or a shortage of serpents overshadow a good story. Their aim was to awe and instill terror, to celebrate martial virtue, to demonize the foe. But in spite of their mythopoetic stylings, these medieval scribes often drew from a kernel of plausibility, aware that their audience, while undoubtedly inclined toward superstition, still existed in a very real, physical world. One might well enthrall a medieval crowd with tales of supernatural feats, but an execution is more gripping if it's grounded in the tangibility of mortal possibility. We might also look askance at those who cry, "Absurd! Snake pits are the stuff of biblical allegory, mere cautionary fables to depict serpentine evil." And yes, the symbolism is thick enough to spread. The serpent has always held a special place in the theocratic imagination, from Eden's sly deceiver to the eternally feared cosmic dragons of apocalyptic lore. But to brand all uses of serpents as metaphorical is a sloppy oversimplification. Why not exploit that symbolic power in a real physical event? A cunning king with some theatrics up his sleeve could easily leverage the collective dread of snakes, employing them in a brutal show of power meant to subdue not only the condemned but all who dare question the throne. What we find, then, is an altogether plausible, though ghastly, answer to that perennial question. Could a man truly be executed in a snake pit in 9th century Britain? Not only could he, but the synergy of the era's savage imagination, the ready availability of adders, especially at the cusp of hibernation, and the savage, punitive culture of the time makes it downright credible. Medieval rulers, determined to stamp out perceived threats with a flourish, would gladly orchestrate such a flamboyant death if they believed it served both religious terror and political intimidation. To be clear, none of this proves that it did happen in precisely that manner. History, especially from the vantage of these shadowy centuries, is a maddening labyrinth of partial truths, scribal embellishments, and heroic braggadocio. Yet the confluence of climatic nuance, ecological feasibility, and unrelenting medieval brutality rubbishes the assumption that this entire story belongs to the realm of fairy tales. If anything, the very real possibility that a relatively mild British viper, collected in obscene quantity, could dispatch a bound man in a pit is more resonant, more believable, and more horrifying than many of the cheerfully accepted legends from this bloody epoch. Thus, when some modern cynic laughs off the notion, oh how droll, that King Aella would have invested time and manpower into such a spectacle, we remind them that medieval kings were forever enacting flamboyant horrors, from impalements to ritual burnings, for far lesser provocations than an invasion by a world-famous Viking. As with many events in human history, the spectacle was the point. Show me a man who doubts the capacity of medieval brutality to push the boundaries of reason, and I shall show you a man who has read no history. The only question left, then, is whether there were enough hands to gather the serpents, and enough sadistic imaginations to carry it out, both of which I fear are quite likely. In the final reckoning, whether you believe Ragnar Lothbrok became Adderchow is secondary to the deeper understanding that the improbable can occasionally prove all too real when it intersects with the darkest chapters of human artifice. We needn't stand in awe of medieval superstition to accept that this brand of cruelty is well within the threshold of historical plausibility. Is it not grimly fitting that the Viking legend, rooted in so much defiance, swagger and blood, should close with the old warrior locked in a macabre dance with venomous serpents? If Ragnar died so, he died in a manner grotesquely befitting his fame, wrapped in the cold coils of lethal imagery, stoking fear among his enemies, and ensuring that bards would sing of his ignoble end for centuries to come. As an atheist and rationalist, I prefer reason and evidence to the ephemeral illusions of myth, but I do not doubt for a moment that our ancestors, in an age fraught with cruelty and ever hungry for dramatic retribution, would stop at nothing, including filling a pit with writhing reptiles, to dispose of a celebrated enemy in the most luridly memorable way possible.